Yeah. So in triaxial test, as the name suggests, you have three axes of compression for an actual soil element under the ground. Because if you consider x, y, and z axis, you know that there are stresses acting in all three directions in a soil element, isn't it? So two lateral and one vertical. Uh, in two lateral and one vertical direction, you will be, your soil element will be experiencing these stresses, right? So in the x direction, y direction, and z direction, so that can be replicated very well in this triaxial compression test, and you can very well control the drainage. So you can do uu, cu, and cd test. All tests can be done in a triaxial compression test. So it's a very famous test, and it will give very good results. And you can plot the Mohr circles very well from the results that you obtain, and you can plot your failure envelope and find out your C and phi parameters. So this test was introduced by Casagrande and Terzaghi in 1936. So as I mentioned, the test specimen is compressed by applying all three principal stresses. So if you have seen the video already, you would have noticed that the specimen is enclosed in a rubber membrane so that it is prevented from having any contact with the cell fluid. So whatever condition the specimen is in at the field, the exact same conditions can be replicated in the triaxial compression test. So you will have uh, a test setup, something that looks like this. So this is your sample. As you can see here, this is your sample. So this sample is enclosed in a rubber sheath so that it is secluded from this fluid surrounding it. Okay, this is your compression chamber, triaxial test equipment. One, you can see that it's a loading area. You can apply your axial load using this, and there will be a proving ring above this. All right, then the loading is through this 1 and 2. Then 3, you have an air release valve. Then 4, you have a top cap of the above your sample. And 5 is a perplex cylinder. The whole thing, it's a cylinder. It looks like glass, so you can see what is happening inside. Then 6 is a sealing ring. This one sealing ring. Then 7 is a pour water outlet, as you can see here. 8 is another additional pour water outlet. 9 is a cell fluid inlet so that the fluid fills in this gap. Then 10 is my soil element, soil specimen, and 11 is a porous disc so that the soil particles doesn't flow out, but the water in the soil specimen test. So what I do is I will extract an undisturbed soil sample from the field, or I can always remold it in the lab as well. I can obtain a disturbed sample from the field, and I will mix the field condition. From the field conditions, I'll find out the density and water content of the soil sample. So in the same water content and moisture and density, I can remold a sample in the lab as well. Okay, so that samples are called remolded samples. Okay, so I can make a remolded sample, or the best is to obtain an undisturbed sample from the field. So that sample I will place here. I will keep a rubber sheath around it. Then I will start filling the cell fluid. I'll pump water through this valve 9. Okay, so that this area is filled with water. Okay, so the more water I try to fill in, the more pressure you can apply all around this sample. Okay, so that is going to be my sigma 3. That's going to be my minor principal stress. It's going to act all around my soil sample. Okay, so then what I'm going to do is, if I keep my valves 8 and 7 open, then what will happen? Due to this pressure all around, see, you can see here sigma 3 acts all around. This is my sample of length L and D diameter. So L is usually double the diameter, okay, for these samples. Then I'll apply the sigma 3 using the cell pressure. Then what will happen? if the valves 8 and 7 are open, what will happen? That pore water will slowly dissipate. It will move out through this and the soil sample is going to consolidate. If I keep 7 and 8 closed, what will happen? The water is not going to drain out. There will not be any volume change. There will not be any consolidation. If I keep the valves open throughout the experiment, then I can replicate a CD test, consolidated drained test, isn't it? So once I keep the sample, then I fill the cell area with fluid so that sigma 3 acts. Then what will happen? Then I will have to apply my shearing load here. I'll apply this normal load here so that the sample fails in shear. So that load I am applying here is called my deviatoric stress. All right. So my total sigma 1 here is going to be how much? Major principal stress is going to be how much? Whatever deviatoric stress you apply here plus the already applied sigma 3, isn't it? So you can see sigma 3 is applied throughout. Then I will apply my deviatoric stress. So my total major principal stress sigma 1 will be that sigma d, deviatoric stress I am applying on top, or the load that I am applying on top, plus the sigma 3 plus the cell pressure. That will be my sigma 1. So now you have your sigma 1 and you have your sigma 3. Now from the proving ring readings, you will notice whether when your sample is failing in shear. All right. So for these sigma 1 and sigma 3, you will keep on increasing your sigma d. And from the proving ring reading, you will identify when your sample is failing. So you have different, you have fixed the sigma 3 initially. Then you kept on increase after consolidation stage, you kept on increasing your sigma d. If it is a consolidated test, then after consolidation using sigma 3, you will slowly start increasing your sigma d, right? So once the sample fails, you can notice that deviatoric stress, then you can calculate your sigma 1, which will be equal to that sigma 3 value plus the deviatoric stress that you just applied to fail your sample in shear. So now you have your sigma 1, you have your sigma 3. Can you plot your Mohr circle? Yes. So that's the first set of the experiment. The second set of the experiment, you will increase your sigma 3. You will increase your confining pressure. For that confining normal pressure, what is your sigma d? The second experiment. So for that sigma d, for that sigma 3, what is your sigma d? Now you can calculate your sigma 1 again. Now you have another set of sigma 1 and sigma 3 values. Now can you plot another Mohr circle? So once you have at least 2 Mohr circles, I think you can easily draw your failure envelope. So once you get your failure envelope, then things are very easy, isn't it? From the graph itself, you can read out your C and phi values. Or you have the basic equations for sigma 1 and sigma 3, isn't it? Sigma 1 is equal to sigma 3 tan square alpha plus 2c tan alpha. We saw that equation 2 days back, didn't we? So if you have two sets of these values, you can solve it. No, if you have two equations connecting sigma 1 and sigma 3, you can solve those equations analytically and you can get the values of C and phi as well. So you can either solve it graphically or you can solve it analytically, right? Is that clear? So this test is continued either until the proving ring shows a failure or until 20% strain is noticed. You will keep on compressing your sample, and once you have reached 20% of the strain, then you will stop your test. I will explain later why. Okay. So deviatoric stress at any point is given by you apply a particular deviator force at the top, and AC will be the corrected area of cross section of the specimen at that stage. Why? Because you have already applied some normal stress, the sample might have deformed a little bit. So the initial area of cross section might not be, the initial area of cross section might have been pi r square, right? Because the radius of the sample is r, diameter is d. So the initial area of cross section would be pi r square, but once you apply the sigma 3 and sigma d, the sample is going to slightly deform, isn't it? So once the sample has deformed, the area of cross section onto which you are going to apply your deviatoric force is going to vary. So for accurate calculation, you have to find out your actual corrected area of cross section on which you apply this deviatoric force. So now you will calculate your deviatoric force, sigma d, deviatoric stress, sigma d is equal to deviatoric force F by corrected area of cross section. And AI is my initial area of cross section, Li is my initial length of specimen, AC is my corrected area of cross section of the specimen when axial compression is delta L and the change in volume is delta V. So now my initial volume Vi is equal to AILI, and volume at any stage of compression will be equal to Vi plus delta V. Delta V can be plus or minus. It will be equal to AC into Li minus delta L, because delta L is going to keep on decreasing. You are compressing your sample is going to continuously decrease in length. So AC corrected area of cross section will be equal to Vi plus delta V by Li minus delta L. So in case of an undrained test, but in the case of an undrained test on saturated sample, we know that the delta V is going to be 0, because there is no change in volume, as there is no drainage allowed, isn't it? The sample doesn't consolidate, the sample doesn't get compressed due to consolidation, due to removal of pore water, right? So in that case, your delta V is going to be 0. So your equation changes AILI by L minus delta L. So taking AI out of it, AI by 1 minus delta L by Li. And we know that delta L by Li is nothing but change in length by actual length. It's nothing but strain, right? So AI by 1 minus epsilon is my actual or corrected area of cross section. So once you have your sigma D at failure or sigma D at 20% strain, you have your major principal stress sigma 1, sigma D plus sigma 3. So once you have those two values, you can plot your Mohs circle. So different number of tests are conducted with different sigma 3 values, different cell pressures. So you will get different combinations of sigma 3 and sigma D. So once you have your sigma D, you can calculate your sigma 1, which is equal to sigma D plus sigma 3, right? So you have different sets of sigma 1 and sigma 3. Now you can plot your different Mohs circles for different values of sigma 1 and sigma 3. Once you have that, plot your failure envelope, obtain your C and phi from the plot, as you can see here. All right. This is how triaxial compression test is done. Hope it's clear. So in the triaxial test, there are different ways in which a sample can fail. So one is brittle failure, another one is semi-plastic failure, and the last one is plastic failure. So in brittle failure, you have a well-defined failure plane and a little lateral bulging. And in semi-plastic failure, you have failure with shear cones and little lateral bulging, as you can see in the figure. And in plastic failure, you have excessive lateral bulging and absence of a well-defined shear plane. So the first one, brittle failure, is generally observed in undisturbed, highly sensitive clay. So what is sensitive clay? We will see that. Okay. Undisturbed, highly sensitive clay, you can observe brittle failure, and semi-plastic and plastic failure you can observe in remolded sensitive clay, usually, generally. Okay, it's a general identification. All right. Next comes unconfined compression test. Hope you have seen the video of this test as well. So this is also a type of triaxial test. We can say it's a special case of triaxial test, as the name suggests. Unconfined compression test. There is no confinement here, isn't it? Unconfined compression test. So there is no confinement here. So your sigma 3 is 0 and sigma 2 is also 0. So you apply only axial compression, that is your sigma D, or sigma 1 only is applied in this test. So now you might ask me, so sir, how can we do tests on sandy soils? Because sandy soils cannot stand, you cannot make a sample of diameter D and L is equal to 2D unsupported in sandy soil. Correct. You cannot, make a mold a sample, or you cannot get an undisturbed sample in that dimensions, because sandy soil doesn't stand unsupported for that ratio, isn't it? So you cannot carry out, it's not easy to carry out. I mean, if it is a wet sandy soil, maybe you can try, but it doesn't make any sense, because right when you apply some deviated load, it's going to fail, because sandy soils cannot stand on its own. But clay soils not like that. Clay soils have some cohesion, so they will stick to each other, and you can easily mold it into different shapes. So you can mold it into a sample of length L, and where L is equal to 2D, where D is your diameter. So you can mold a sample like that, and that sample you can test in this unconfined compression testing machine. But in the case of sandy soil, it's very difficult because, or impossible, because you cannot make a sample in such a shape. Or even if you extract a sample, undisturbed sample from the field in such a configuration, once you take it out of the mold, then it is going to crumble down, right? I'm right. So you cannot carry out a unconfined compression test on dry sandy soils. Even wet sandy soils, it doesn't make much sense to conduct a unconfined compression test, because even if you are able to slightly mold it into such a shape, you cannot apply any deviatoric stress on it. So this test is conducted on clay soils. All right, soils which can stand unsupported or without any confinement on those soils, only you can do this test. Okay, so sigma 2 and sigma 3 is equal to 0 in this test. Now itself you have to correlate it with the Mohr circle. So where will your Mohr circle start? So the Mohr circle will start at the origin. Now, once you have the sample, you do not have the sigma 2 and sigma 3, and the specimen is compressed at a uniform rate of strain, and you have all these dial gauges and proving ring. Using the dial gauge, you can measure your axial strain, and the proving ring, you can measure your deviatoric stress. So at a uniform rate of strain, you keep on deforming your sample, and the maximum compressive stress resisted by the specimen before failure is called the unconfined compressive stress or strength. All right, so it is denoted by QU. So QU is equal to F by AC, and AC, as we discussed earlier, once you start applying this compressive force, the sample is going to deform. As I showed you here, you can see the sample has deformed, isn't it? So the area of cross section on which you apply this deviatoric force is going to vary once you start the test. So you have to find out the actual or corrected area of cross section on which this acts, right? So QU will be equal to F by AC. So AC, we know it's equal to initial area of cross section by 1 minus axial strain epsilon, because epsilon is equal to change in length by actual length, delta L by L naught. That's my axial strain at the failure point. So it's a very quick test, because there is no confinement, there is no consolidation, nothing, no drainage, nothing. So you mold your sample, keep it on the testing machine, apply your deviatoric force, find out the proving ring reading at which failure occurs, or you strain it till 20% of the total length. That's it. And you will find out what is that deviatoric force that you applied. Then you find out your F by AC, you find out your corrected area of cross section. Now you have your deviatoric stress, or the sigma 1, because sigma d is equal to sigma 1 in this case, isn't it? Because the sigma 3 is 0. So you have your QU, which is the same as your sigma d, and your sigma 1. So if you look at these graphs, so for purely cohesive soil, as you can see here, in both these conditions, this is C5 soil. What is C5 soil? Both sand and clay will be there in C5 soil. Okay, it will be like SC is a C5 soil, isn't it? Sand and clay. So soils which have both cohesion and angle of internal friction as their strength parameters, they are called C5 soils. C soil means purely clay soil. They have strength only from cohesion, and phi soils are cohesion-less soils. They get their strength only from phi. So only from phi means they are purely sandy soils. Only from C means they are purely clay soils, and C5 soils means it's a combination of both sand and clay. All right. So for C5 soil, we saw the failure envelope. For C soil, we saw the failure envelope, and for phi soil, we saw the failure envelope. For phi soil, it starts at the origin and it will go on like this, or after a time it will straighten out. All right. So if you look at the graph for purely cohesive soil, you can see that sigma 3 is 0, so it starts here, and sigma 1 is equal to your QU itself, isn't it? The deviatoric stress or the failure stress at which the sample fails. So you just plot a Mohr circle, then you have that tau f is equal to tau max. So obviously your alpha will be equal to 45 degrees, alpha or theta, whichever way you want to call it. So alpha will be equal to 45 degrees. Clear? Alright. And for C5 soil, again you can see it has a C intercept, as you can see here. So you will plot different Mohr circles for this. All right, for different sorry, you can't plot different Mohr circles for this. You can see for sigma 3 is equal to 0, you have for one sample you have this single sigma 1 value, right? So if you try to replicate the actual field conditions and you test it, you will get this one single Mohr circle, and for that you can plot your failure envelope. The slope of this failure envelope, it is your phi, and and this is your Cu, or Cu represents your undrained cohesion and undrained angle of internal friction. Right? So for purely cohesive soils, you have the Mohs circle. C5 soil, you have the Mohs circle. And you can see here in purely cohesive soil, you have a failure plane inclined at an angle of 45 degrees. As you can see here, this is 45 degrees. And in this case, obviously, your failure plane is going to be 45 plus 5 by 2, isn't it? As you can see here, this is going to be greater than 45. Then I have vane shear test. I have vane shear test in the field. I have vane shear test in the lab. So if you have an undisturbed sample, if you don't have an undisturbed sample, then shear strength can be determined using the device called a shear vane. So it can also be conducted in the laboratory. So it has 4 steel plates welded orthogonally to a steel rod, as you can see here. Okay. So this is your equipment handle, and this is the 4 steel plates welded orthogonally to the steel rod. This you will connect here. This you will connect here. Different sizes and shape, different sizes of these steel plates. So you will connect this vane here, and you will rotate this into the soil. Okay, that's what you're gonna do. So this is a vane, 4 steel plates welded together. So this you will connect here to this handle, and this you will rotate. This you will rotate and drive this vane into the ground. Okay. So the torque applied for driving this into the ground is actually measured by a calibrated torsion spring. A uniform rotation of 1 degree per minute is used. So the vane is now forced into the soil at the bottom of a borehole, and torque is applied. You can do it at the surface also. You can keep this inserted at the ground surface and you will rotate it. So the torsion spring will measure the applied torque. So the torque corresponding to angle of rotation at uniform intervals are noted, and the torque is plotted against the angle of rotation. So now you have from that calibrated graph, as you can see in the bottom right, from this calibrated graph, you can find out your torque required at failure. Right? This is a calibrated chart. From this, you can observe your torque required at failure. Okay. So once you have that value, so look at this figure here. Torque head. This you will rotate this, and you will find out from the calibrated chart. You will find out this. You will find out the torque required at failure. Okay. So this you will rotate. So H here, there are 2 different dimensions. One is the laboratory vane and the other one is the field vane. So the laboratory vane, you have a height of 20 mm, diameter of 12 mm, and thickness of 0.5 to 1 mm. In the field vane, these are the dimensions 10 to 20, 5 to 10, and 2.5 centimeters. All right. If both top and bottom of the vane partake in shearing the soil, if you have inserted your vane completely in the ground and then you start rotating it and calculating the torque, then both the top and bottom of the vane will partake in shearing the soil. So in that case, you can find out the strength of the soil. Tau F is equal to torque at failure Tf by pi d square into h by 2 plus d by 6, where h is the height of the vane and d is the diameter of the vane and Tf is the torque required at failure. So substitute here, you will get your shear strength of the soil. All right. But if only one end of the vane partakes in shearing, you have just inserted the bottom part of the vane in the ground and you have started rotating it. In that case, this is the equation. You will change this, switch this 6 to 12. That's it. All right, so it's a very simple plug and play kind of a test. You will just insert the vane, calculate the torque, plug it into this equation, you have the answer. That's it. So shear strength of different soils is the last topic in this chapter. For cohesive soils, that is clay soils, the shear strength of the cohesive soils is dependent upon many factors, as I am mentioning here. So the most important factor, it depends whether the clay soil is normally or pre-consolidated or over-consolidated. What is the difference between normally consolidated clay and over-consolidated clay or pre-consolidated clay? What is the difference? Normally consolidated clay means your clay is experiencing the existing stress for the first time. The soil is getting consolidated due to that stress for the first time. right? It hasn't experienced such a stress in the past, and it hasn't undergone that much consolidation in the past. But in the case of pre-consolidated or over-consolidated soil, what happens is the soil has already experienced such a pressure in the past, and it has already consolidated more than what the existing or current stress can consolidate. That is over consolidated soil. So normally consolidated soil, it hasn't experienced such a high stress in its past, and it hasn't consolidated that much. It is experiencing this pressure for the first time, and it is just consolidating now. That is normally consolidated soil. So the strength behavior of cohesive soil basically depends upon whether the soil is NC or OC clay, normally consolidated or over consolidated clay. Then whether the sample is undisturbed or remolded, whether you are obtaining a sample without disturbing any of the site conditions, you have the in situ density, water content, etc., or whether you are reconstructing or remolding the sample at the lab. So that also contributes to a change in shear behavior. Then drainage conditions, of course, drainage conditions, because pore pressure will build up and you will get the you will not get the true cohesion or true phi, but you will get the apparent cohesion or the apparent angle of internal friction instead of my effective or true C and phi, isn't it? Then consistency of the clay, the more water you add, the behavior of clay changes, right? Do you remember the consistency limit, shrinkage limit, plastic limit, and liquid limit? So we saw how clay behaves differently and how the volume changes for these different levels of water content or at these different consistencies. And at shrinkage limit, we saw that the clay is having minimum water content and it is pretty hard. But in the case of liquid limit, the clay soil loses all its strength and flows like a liquid, isn't it? So that it doesn't have any shear strength in its liquid limit, correct? So consistency also affects the shear strength of clay soil. Then the structural effects, of course, whether the sample is dispersed or flocculated depends upon its bonding. Depending upon all these factors, you have difference in shear strength. Then the type of test that you're going to carry out on the test or on the sample, whether it is a stress control, strain controlled, CDs, which type of test you are going to carry out. Then the rate of strain. If you apply the strain very fast, what will happen? The pore water cannot dissipate very easily. But if you apply the strain very slowly, the pore water will slowly dissipate and you will get the actual strength parameters of the soil. So the shear strength of clay soil depend upon all these parameters, right? Similarly, shear strength of cohesionless soils, but in the other hand, shear strength of cohesionless soil or sandy soil, it basically depends upon the frictional resistance between the grains and the interlocking between the particles, isn't it? Just remember my knuckle theory. So if you interlock your knuckles, how well you interlock it uh, influences whether you can slide over the other knuckle or not, isn't it? So that frictional resistance between the grains and the interlocking between the sand particles provides the soil its shear strength for cohesionless soils, right? So if your sand is very dense, all right, if your sand is very dense, that means the particles have minimum void ratio and the particles have very good interparticle contact, isn't it? So Mohs circle shows large ordinates and steeper slope for dense soil rather than loose soil. Why? Because if the soil is very dense, of course, your angle of internal friction is going to be pretty high because the interparticle contact is very high. So if the interparticle contact is very high, there is more surface area contact between the particles. So what happens? The friction generated will be very high when compared to that of loose soils, correct? So you have a steeper slope for the failure envelope. So in the case of sandy soils, the shear strength of sandy soils, it basically depends upon the density of packing, right? How dense you have packed your particles, density index. So that also contributes to, that influences the shear strength of the soil. Then particle shape, right? Particle shape. How does particle shape affect the shear strength of sandy soils? Whether it depends, just, compare a very angular soil particle and a very well-rounded soil particle. Which one will be easy to roll over each other? very well rounded, one can roll over each other very fast, isn't it? Because there is no angular surfaces which might interlock and prevent that movement, right? So if the particle shape it's very well rounded, then the friction generated is very minimum when compared to that of a very angular particle, right? Then the surface roughness, that also contributes to the friction between the particles to prevent it from sliding or rolling. Then particle size distribution, if the particle size distribution, if it is uniform, then you have larger voids, so the interparticle contact will be less, correct? But if the particle is well graded, you have different range of size of particles in the soil, then the voids will be filled with smaller particles, so there will be more interparticle contact and friction, so it will be more dense and it will be tougher to roll a particle over each other, right? So these parameters will affect the shear strength of cohesionless soil. Another new term that I want to introduce to you now is angle of repose. I am sure that every one of you have seen a truck unloading soil. Everyone have seen that, isn't it? A truck unloading soil or soil unloaded at a site somewhere. Even in our campus, you might have seen it many places. So what shape does it lie? It lies as a heap, correct? The soil that is unloaded from the truck, it lies in a heap. So that represents the soil in its loosest state, right? You have the minimum density index in that condition. So if the soil is dropped from a small height, it can stand without support in a coned shape, right? So that cone shape or that angle that slope makes with the horizontal is called as angle of repose. Okay, the angle of repose. So it's the angle with the horizontal at which a heap of dry sand poured freely from a small height will stand without support. So that essentially represents the angle of friction in the loosest state. All right. So that can be the minimum phi. If you measure that angle, you can see that that is the minimum phi a soil can have, a loose dry sand, a heap of dry sand can have. All right. So this is a new term I want to introduce now, angle of repose. So the stress strain relationship of sands, it basically depends upon the initial state of compactness or the density index. So the stress strain relation for sand in loose, medium and dense states. So this we will discuss in the next class and we will start working out some problems in the next class. Alright, so once that is done, we will wind up this topic.